Hey everybody, it's Miss Finster. So for this section of the textbook, The Allies Turn the Tide, to learn about this important moment in World War II, we are actually going to use this video to capture the recordings from your online textbook, which you can also access through Realize Reader. Um, so I won't add a whole lot of commentary. You'll mostly be watching this to listen to the audio recording. But what I would probably recommend, especially if your eyes are starting to hurt from so much screen time, is you could also, during the audio recordings, if you have access to your textbook, read your actual physical textbook while you listen to the audio recording. Okay? But up to you either way. I'm not going to play the recording on this first page because it's going to go over objectives and key terms, and I want to get into the text reading. But I will pause a moment for you to look at the visual and I'll read the caption for you. Women learn new skills in order to participate in that war effort. In some countries, they served in combat and worked in manufacturing. Women also offered daycare for children of those who worked or served. Okay? So you're going to see a shift in the workforce. Women are joining it to help the war effort. Okay. All right, a commitment to total war.
A commitment to total war. As 1942 began, the Allies were in trouble. German bombers flew unrelenting raids over Britain, and the German army advanced deep into the Soviet Union. In the Pacific, the Japanese onslaught seemed unstoppable. But helped by extraordinary efforts on the home front and a series of military victories, the tide was about to turn. Like the Axis powers they were fighting, the Allies committed themselves to total war. In total war, nations devote all of their resources to the war effort. Governments redirect resources. To achieve maximum war production, democratic governments in the United States and Great Britain increased their economic and political power. They directed economic resources into the war effort, ordering factories to stop making cars or refrigerators and to turn out airplanes or tanks instead. They raised money by holding war bond drives. By buying bonds, citizens lent their government certain sums of money that would be returned with interest later. Wartime economic policies placed limits on individual economic freedoms. Governments implemented programs to ration or control the amount of certain vital goods consumers could buy. Rationed items included rubber, tin, gasoline, and certain food items. Prices and wages were also regulated. In the United States, the war stimulated the economy by creating millions of new jobs. Unemployment, which had remained high during the Great Depression, was almost wiped out.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there to give you a moment to look at the below visual. World War II GDP, so gross domestic product, which is the value of goods and services being made, produced in a nation, and can be considered a way to analyze the size and growth of the economy of that nation. And then that's being compared to aircraft and tank production. So I'll give you a moment to look at that while I read the caption. The Allies' commitment to all-out war meant a shift in manufacturing from commercial to military goods, and equipment. Producing for the war effort also helped keep Americans employed. Okay. All right, I'm going to move up and continue the reading.
Limits on individual rights. Under the pressures of war, even democratic governments limited the rights of citizens. They censored the press and used propaganda to win public support for the war. In the United States and Canada, racial prejudice and concerns about security led to the internment or confinement during wartime of citizens of Japanese descent. Japanese Americans on the West Coast and Japanese Canadians were forced to move to camps inland where conditions were very poor. In Britain, Germans, Austrians, and Italians were subjected to internment, although some of them, including Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, were released. Some 40 years later, both the United States and Canada provided former internees with reparations, or payment for damages. For most, the compensation came too late. Women help win the war. As men joined the military, millions of women around the world replaced them in essential war industry jobs. Women, symbolized by the character Rosie the Riveter in the United States, built ships and planes and produced munitions. British and American women served in the armed forces in many auxiliary roles, driving ambulances, delivering airplanes, and decoding messages. In occupied Europe, women fought in the resistance. Marie Fourcade, a French woman, helped downed Allied pilots escape to safety. Soviet women served in combat roles. Soviet pilot Lily Litvak, for example, shot down 12 German planes before she herself was killed. Identify central...
All right, gonna pause there, go on to the next page. So as you can see, there's definitely some progressive movements occurring, especially with women joining the workforce, and the economy growing in many nations, especially the United States, which of course prior to that was the Great Depression. So fortunately, with the war effort, it increases employment significantly. However, we also have quite a bit of negative things occurring as well. Racial prejudice being one example. Okay, going on to the next. Progress on 3 fronts.
Progress on 3 fronts. During 1942 and 1943, the Allies won several victories that would turn the tide of battle. They fought on 3 main fronts, in North Africa and Italy, in the Soviet Union, and in the Pacific. Japan suffers setbacks. In the Pacific, the Japanese suffered their first serious setback at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The battle lasted for 5 days in May 1942. For the first time in naval history, ships engaged in a battle in which they never even saw each other. Attacks were carried out by planes launched from aircraft carriers, or ships that transport aircraft and accommodate the takeoff and landing of airplanes. The Allies prevented Japan from seizing several important islands. More importantly, the Americans sank 1 Japanese aircraft carrier and several cruisers and destroyers. This Allied victory was followed by an even more impressive win at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, which was also fought entirely from the air. The Americans destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and more than 250 planes. The battle was a devastating blow to the Japanese. After Midway, Japan was unable to launch any more offensive operations. Compare and contrast Churchill's, Roosevelt's, and Stalin's goals for Europe. The loss was a setback to Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. Tojo, who also served as war minister, had been popular during Japan's string of victories. After Midway, he faced increasing opposition at home. Big Three strategize. After the United States entered the war, the Allied leaders met periodically to hammer out their strategy. In 1942, the Big Three, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, agreed to focus on finishing the war in Europe before trying to end the war in Asia. From the outset, the Allies distrusted one another. Churchill and Roosevelt feared that Stalin wanted to dominate Europe. Stalin believed the West wanted to destroy communism. None of the new Allies wanted to risk a breakdown in their alliance, however. At a conference in Tehran, Iran, in late 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt yielded to Stalin by agreeing to let the borders outlined in the Nazi-Soviet Pact stand, against the wishes of Poland's government in exile. Stalin also wanted Roosevelt and Churchill to open a second front against Germany in Western Europe to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union. Roosevelt and Churchill replied that they did not yet have the resources. Stalin saw the delay as a deliberate policy to weaken the Soviet Union. Victory in North Africa. In North Africa, British forces led by General Bernard Montgomery fought Rommel. After the fierce Battle of El Alamein in November 1942, the Allies finally halted the Desert Fox's advance. Allied tanks drove the Axis back across Libya into Tunisia. Later in 1942, American General Dwight Eisenhower took command of a joint British and American force in Morocco and Algeria. Advancing on Tunisia from the west, the Allies trapped Rommel's army, which surrendered in May 1943. Allied invasion of Italy. With North Africa under their control, the Allies were able to cross the Mediterranean into Italy. In July 1943, the combined British and American army landed first in Sicily and then in southern Italy. They defeated the Italian forces there in about a month. After the defeats, the Italians overthrew Mussolini and signed an armistice, but fighting did not end. Hitler sent German troops to rescue Mussolini and stiffen the will of Italians fighting in the north. For the next 18 months, the Allies pushed slowly up the Italian peninsula, suffering heavy losses against strong German resistance. Still, the Italian invasion was a decisive event for the Allies because it weakened Hitler by forcing him to fight on another front. Turning point in Stalingrad. A major turning point occurred in the Soviet Union. After their lightning advance in 1941, the Germans were stalled outside Moscow and Leningrad. In 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive. This time he aimed for the rich oil fields of the south. His troops, however, got only as far as Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the costliest of the war. Hitler was determined to capture Stalin's namesake city, and Stalin was equally determined to defend it. The battle began when the Germans surrounded the city. As winter closed in, a bitter street-by-street, house-by-house struggle raged. A German officer wrote that soldiers fought for 2 weeks for a single building. Corpses are strewn in the cellars, on the landings, and the staircases, he said. In November, the Soviets encircled their attackers. Trapped, without food or ammunition, and with no hope of rescue, the German commander finally surrendered in January 1943. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army took the offensive and drove the invaders out of the Soviet Union entirely. Hitler's forces suffered irreplaceable losses of both troops and equipment. By early 1944, Soviet troops were advancing into Eastern Europe. Draw conclusions.
All right, next page. All right, a second front in Europe.
A second front in Europe. Practice spelling familiar words that appear in a second front in Europe. By 1944, the Western Allies were at least ready to open a second front in Europe by invading France. General Dwight Eisenhower was made the supreme Allied commander. He and other Allied leaders faced the enormous task of planning the operation and assembling troops and supplies. To prepare the way for the invasion, Allied bombers flew constant missions over Germany. They targeted factories and destroyed aircraft that might be used against the invasion force. They also destroyed many German cities and bombed railroads and bridges in France that could carry German troops and supplies to the front. The Normandy landings. The Allies chose June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, for the invasion of France. Just before midnight on June 5th, Allied planes dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. Then at dawn, thousands of ships ferried 156,000 Allied troops across the English Channel. The troops fought their way to shore amid underwater mines and raking machine gun fire, and the casualties mounted as they reached the shore. It all seemed unreal, a sort of dreaming while awake. Men were screaming and dying all around me. I honestly could have walked the full length of the beach without touching the ground. They were that thickly strewn about. Melvin B. Farrell, War Memories. The liberation of France. Despite heavy losses, the Allied troops clawed their way inland from the beaches of Normandy. In early August, a massive armored division under American General George S. Patton helped the joint British and American forces break through German defenses and advance toward Paris. Meanwhile, other Allied forces sailed from Italy to land in southern France. In Paris, French resistance forces rose up against the occupying Germans. Under pressure from all sides, the Germans retreated. On August 25th, the Allies entered Paris. Within a month, all of France was free. Advancing toward Germany. After freeing France, Allied forces battled toward Germany. As their armies advanced into Belgium in December 1944, Germany launched a massive counterattack. At the bloody Battle of the Bulge, which lasted more than a month, both sides took terrible losses. The Germans drove the Allies back in several places, but were unable to break through. The battle delayed the Allied advance from the west, but only for 6 weeks. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive attack. By this time, Germany was reeling under round-the-clock bombing. For 2 years, Allied bombers had hammered military bases, factories, railroads, oil depots, and cities. The goal of the bombing was to cripple Germany's industries and destroy the morale of its civilians. By 1945, Germany could no longer defend itself in the air. In one 10-day period, bombing almost erased the huge industrial city of Hamburg, killing 40,000 civilians and forcing 1 million to flee their homes. In February 1945, Allied raids on Dresden killed as many as 135,000 people. The attack on Dresden later stirred controversy because the city was not an industrial center and had long been seen as one of Europe's most beautiful cities. Meanwhile, the Soviet army battled through Germany and advanced on Berlin from the east. Hitler's support within Germany was declining, and he had already survived one assassination attempt by senior officers in the German military. By early 1945, the defeat of Germany seemed inevitable. The Yalta Conference. As the Allies advanced on Germany, the Big Three met in the Soviet city of Yalta. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin planned for the final stages of the war and for post-war Europe. The meeting took place in an atmosphere of distrust. Stalin insisted that the Soviet Union needed to maintain control of Eastern Europe to be able to protect itself from future aggression. Churchill and Roosevelt favored self-determination for Eastern Europe, which would give people a right to choose their own form of government. Although Stalin agreed to hold free elections in the newly liberated nations of Eastern Europe, he soon showed he had no intention of upholding that promise. The three leaders also outlined a plan for post-war Germany. It would be temporarily divided into 4 zones to be governed by American, French, British, and Soviet forces. Although the war in Europe was almost over, the Allies were less certain of the outcome in the Pacific. Roosevelt and Churchill were eager to get the Russians to declare war on Japan. Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In return, Churchill and Roosevelt promised Stalin that the Soviets would take possession of southern Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, and an occupation zone in Korea. Explain.
All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning from the text this way. Please feel free to give us feedback if this is a preferred way of learning for you. But otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week. And yeah, let us know if you need help with anything. Bye.